and welcome to episode 4 of the Stateless Shinobi Podcast, our continued coverage, part 2, if you will, of our evaluation entitled Faith in Chains, the intersectionality of faith and slavery, or Christianity and slavery, rather. Of course, if you haven't seen part 1, it is below for you to go ahead and take a look at. And just to give you a quick summation, we did a brief historical recounting of the relationship between slavery and Christianity all the way back in the times of antiquity, right after the birth of Jesus the death of Jesus, to the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade, sometimes known as the triangle slave trade, as it relates to America, Europe, and Central Africa. Now, this being the next episode and a continuation of that, and in line with the ethos of a Stateless Shinobi, we're going to change up the format for this one a little bit, and instead of me just sitting here and talking to you, we're going to do a bit of a reaction to another source, an individual by the name of Brian Holdsworth. He also has a channel on YouTube, and I just wanted to bring in a sort of philosophical, more religious angle to the interaction of Christianity and slavery. I know previously in the video that I made prior, I tried to highlight and pretty much hit home that I wasn't trying to make a slam piece on Christianity per se, but rather the institutions claiming to represent Christianity, most definitely the Catholic Church. Now, that being said, I will go ahead and guys let you know that this individual, Brian, he is very wholeheartedly Catholic, and that's totally fine. I think one of the best ways for you to really get a better approximation and a better view on a subject is to thoroughly flesh out the antithesis of your particular stance, and who knows, you may find some truth in there. So with that, let's go ahead and switch it on over and take a look at what Brian has to say. Yep, you see him up there right next to me. Let's get it cracking.
As anyone who's ever finished any level of education knows, a good curriculum of lessons is one that will unfold gradually, such that the most basic level of instruction appears at the beginning, and the most complex and difficult appears at the end. So take something like a math curriculum, for example. The first level instruction will include lessons about counting to a certain number, or maybe counting by 2s or counting by 3s, and maybe just a little bit of addition and subtraction. But higher levels of instruction will include lessons in algebra, trigonometry, and functions. And in between these two levels are a series of progressive lessons that help prepare the students for those higher levels. The curriculum is designed in such a way to progressively reveal knowledge to the students. Now, with that in mind, what would you think of somebody who looks at a curriculum like that and criticizes it by only ever looking at the first level of instruction and saying things like, this is a math curriculum, they're only counting a little bit and doing a little bit of addition, they're not even getting to long division, how is this a good math curriculum? And then they deliberately and selectively quote just from that first level of instruction to show other people how bad a curriculum it is. They point out how rudimentary and inferior it is because it doesn't cover concepts that the rest of us already know and take for granted because we are educated.
Okay, let's take a quick pause right there. I just want to say, first of all, I love that analogy of like Christianity or biblical scripture being akin to a curriculum for humanity on like moral-based virtue. I think that, again, as I alluded to in my previous video, a lot of times people don't like to take into context the historical or cultural relativism of the periods in which different parts of the Bible were written in. And I think, again, that's a huge fallacy that a lot of people make, where they're like, oh, it says this in the Bible, it says this in the Bible. Again, along with like the Old Testament, New Testament, Old Covenant, New Covenant split, a lot of people like to hammer down really hard on the Old Testament God, but Old Testament God was dealing with Old Testament people. I think it's a pretty poignant thing to say that God sort of meets you where you are, and if we hold that as kind of true, then I think it isn't too big of a leap to say, hey, he was teaching the Old Testament folk 1 + 1. And once we got to Jesus, that's when we got into a little bit more long division. By that same token, though, I think it's also worthy of noting how the same way he says that scripture can be taken out of context or like the pointed to the 1+1 portion of the Christian curriculum, as it were, could be taken out of context to say the curriculum isn't good at all. I think it can also be taken out of context within the atmosphere of justifying slavery. And as a matter of fact, I think that's something that we often see associated with it. We see like justifications for slavery coming from Christians during the period of the transatlantic slave trade, of like, servants do unto your masters, or slave do unto your masters. I don't remember that exact scripture, but you also see like justifications like the curse of Ham, also, which a lot of contemporaries of that time tried to use as a justification for the inferiority of African Americans, and thus their consignment to perpetual servitude and slavery. So I think by the same token that he's using selective viewership or selective adherence to of different biblical scriptures, particularly that in the Old Testament, there was also a lot of that going on within the church in order to justify a lot of bad and what I would argue are not Christian-like behaviors. But with that, let's just keep it going. I don't want to take it too long. Let's hear what else he has to say.
Wouldn't you think that that's dishonest? Wouldn't you think that that's a slanderous and fallacious way of describing that curriculum? Well, something like that goes on when critics treat the topic of the church and the Bible all the time, especially on the topic of slavery.
Brian Holdsworth, the video will be in the description if you guys want to take a look at his stuff.
I think you could describe the Bible as a spiritual and ethical curriculum which depicts the gradual unfolding of knowledge and experience for those who were being formed in history by God, so that they would eventually come to a full knowledge of what is good and true. So you might identify one of the first lessons with the story of God's liberation of the Jewish people from Egypt through his prophet Moses, in which he gave them the 10 Commandments and then the Mosaic Law. But these are just the first few introductory lessons. God goes on to continue to reveal what is good and true to these people throughout their history until the fullness of that teaching is revealed in the person and teachings of Jesus. Jesus is like the trigonometry in this math curriculum.
Great analogy, Ryan.
Atheists and critics of Christianity doing is going back to that first lesson and selectively quoting from it and saying, look how evil the Bible is for not fixing all.
Okay, so just another quick pause there. One thing I want to point out is when you do point towards some problematic or what I would say is perhaps wrongfully led Christian groups, the correlation that I tend to notice is a lot of them tend to be very, very, very heavy on the Old Testament. When you see people clashing to like a violent degree with homosexuality, or clashing to a violent degree with a whole lot of other things, not to say that, they may have not be able to have a disagreement, or if you're in disagreement with somebody's lifestyle that you're automatically an evil person. But I think the vitriol and the degree to which people accept this religious fervor perhaps isn't taken into context when understanding the paradigm that he's describing as far as the 1+1, 2+2, and the gradual integration of certain ideals towards the ultimate realizations that Jesus had within the model of Christianity. A lot of times you tend to see a correlation between those groups and just really steadfast adherence to the Old Testament. I mean, there are stuff in the Old Testament about like wearing mixed fabrics. So if you're wearing polyester right now, you're breaking an aspect of Mosaic law, or sitting in a seat that a woman who has been on her period has sat in, or things along those lines. And I mean, honestly, if you've ever been to a high school, you've probably sat in that seat before. But what you have to realize, I feel like, it's a lot of those laws may have come in direct relation to the cultural and societal environment that they found themselves in. I mean, like, cleanliness was a whole lot bigger when you didn't understand germs. The need to propagate your tribe and have your tribe grow would perhaps have some pretty heavy connotations on homosexuality. Not saying that, I can't assume what God meant or what was going on in that time, but I'm just saying, logically speaking, I feel like a lot of those old covenant rules has some basis in facilitating that particular tribe's growth to the eventual realization of Jesus. But I don't want to go too long on that. Let's keep going and listen to what Brian has to say.
all the moral things that we can identify from that time period. You have to remember, the Bible is telling us about a people who had to be told that murder and killing was wrong. God is starting at the rudest possible level to help humanity begin somewhere. So he starts with a legal system that introduces the concept of justice.
Yeah.
This is like the 1 + 1 and the counting by twos lesson in ethics. So getting back to the topic of slavery, what critics will do is they'll quote these first ethical lessons in the Bible and condemn it as inferior to other ethical systems, while ignoring everything that came after it, up to and including the teachings and actions of the church. But the first thing I'd want to point out is that no other ethical curriculum in the world condemned slavery. Every other nation and civilization up until
big claim there
had slavery. The Persians had it, the Egyptians had it.
There might be some basis of fact there.
The Chinese had it. The Africans had it.
I think by the same token, we can make the argument that there were
the Islamic world. You better believe
inferred principles that would prevent its realization in Christianity. There might be some in other religions as well. Sort of some research, guys. Let me know in the comments.
In the very first lesson of its ethical curriculum, and calling it inferior, while no other ethical framework in the world accounted for it either. Again, using that math curriculum analogy, that's like looking at the first lesson of the curriculum and condemning it as inferior to everything else because it doesn't have long division. Meanwhile, no other curriculum in the world ever even gets to long division. So the question then becomes, if long division is analogous to remedying the evils of slavery, does the church ever get to it? Or can atheists and critics continue to lay this condemnation at the feet of the church? Well, I would argue that Christianity
that's a mixed bag.
Far better than merely outlawing it. Outlawing something.
Okay, so just a quick pause there. I think we have a conflation of the church as espoused as his, he's a Catholic believer. The church being synonymous with the truth of Jesus. I think that it's pretty readily evident that there are many instances throughout history in which the Catholic Church operated in ways that were not in line with Jesus's teaching. Some of those I referred to in our past video. Again, go ahead and take a look if you haven't. But I think there's a bit of a misnomer going on there and a bit of a mix-up. Completely understandable, given that he is a man of the Catholic faith, and to him that is the truth. However, I would perhaps argue, not being Catholic myself, that just because the Pope made it to being the Pope doesn't mean that he's encapsulating God's will. And I don't think that's too big of a stretch if you look at some of the history and actions of some of the heads of the church in the past. But let's keep it going.
Is the sort of simple authoritarian way of fixing something you don't like. It usually means identifying something you don't like, doing nothing to understand the implications of abolishing it, and then just coercively legislating against it. In the case of slavery, you have to understand that, especially in the ancient world, the concept was very different from the more modern versions of it that we are more familiar with.
True.
It was part of the fabric of stability for many people, and it was often the lesser evil of various alternatives.
Oh, wow. So I do think he is hitting on something, particularly when we look at antiquity. Like Roman slavery, some of the other cultural groups that he described. Of course, in our other video, we did refer to slavery as not being race-based preeminently, but warfare-based. And I do think what he's saying, I don't know if he's going to get to it or not, but it does have some bearing in regards to that, because if we go back to antiquity and, hey, my army just beat your army, or my city-state just conquered your city-state, now we have all these women and children. There are pretty much in antiquity only two options for that, or three options rather. Either we kill them all, bloodbath, either we leave them, they starve, perhaps create an issue further in the future that creates more instability, or we take them as slaves. So I think strictly within the realm of antiquity, and it being in that warfare-based society, or based upon warfare, not racial-based chattel slavery, but in that instance, I think that it would bear some some consideration as to why the church may or may not have had issue with that particular form. Might be something to discuss. Let me know what your thoughts are, guys, on that. That's pretty interesting. Let's get some ninjas in the comments to give their takes, and maybe we'll review them in the next video. But let's hear what he has to say about it. I'm wondering if he's going to take that route, or perhaps maybe talk about how a lot of people had like food instability, and they would take the route of selling themselves into slavery rather than starving to death. Let's see what he has to say.
In the ancient world, things could get desperate very fast for
Very
a lot of
true.
people, and slavery was often the better alternative to you and your family starving to death.
Starving
People
or
would
getting
often
murked by an
sell
army.
other family members
Oh, yeah,
into
he took the
slavery because they
selling
knew that they
themselves.
couldn't-
Okay, he took
they
that route,
couldn't make
guys.
for themselves anymore. And this would at least give them.
I would argue it was a minority
But in many
group.
cases-
Let me put this on pause. I would argue it was probably a minority group of people who were taking that route to put themselves into slavery. I could be wrong again, but I would think that preeminently it came as a result of conflict or warfare. Perhaps in more established societies and stuff like that, selling your daughter or something along those lines, or son. Maybe in some tribal areas in the Middle East, maybe it was normal to do that. But again, I would typically believe that it was more likely, or the vast majority of slaves probably came from some sort of conflict or warfare as repercussions of that. But let's hear what he has to say. I don't want to keep jumping in.
There were no other alternatives. So for somebody to just show up and outlaw slavery in the context like that would mean that for those people that chose slavery over starvation, they would now be looking at starvation as their fate. And that's not a great solution. So Jesus and the Bible never do that. They never call for the abolition of slavery as an absolute rule. They do something far better than that. They establish moral principles that we are all called to live by that eventually leads to the abolition of slavery all on its own. Jesus taught us to love our neighbors as ourselves, and that the way that we treat the least among us is how we treat him. And then those that he left in charge of his church to write and compile the New Testament, they taught us that there is no distinction between a slave person or a free person, because we are all equal in Jesus. So it's no wonder that the Roman Empire, which was a massive slave state, when it starts to shift and convert to Christianity, it starts to make huge strides in improving the livelihood and the quality of life for its lowest subjects, including slaves. And by the time you get to the Middle Ages, in which the Catholic Church is the moral conscience of European civilization, slavery becomes more marginalized than it has ever been in history, such that it is practically non-existent. And if there's any doubt about the church's record on this, you just have to go through the history of her teachings. For example, Pope Eugene IV, when word came back to him that Spanish colonialists were abducted.
I just want to take a brief pause there. I got there a little bit late, so I don't know if you guys caught that, but when he talked about how slavery took a huge back page in Europe after the introduction of Christianity, I think that may be accurate by strict definition of the word, but I think a lot of that was more likely alleviated by the fact that, several other historical factors, one of which could be the institution of feudalism, the creation of like a serf class that would have gotten rid of like a lot of that. Perhaps you could even extrapolate like the bubonic plague or the Black Death caused such a decline in number of laborers available that they gave some latitude to those who were left to be laborers and to transit a little bit more. I think that's all to say. I'm not saying either one of those are the all in all answer. If you have an opinion, drop that in the comments and let me know. But I would argue that while slavery might have been affected by some of the moralism that Christianity brought to the table, there were several other external factors that I think bear consideration, and I don't think it's factual or fair to make such a grandiose claim that the implementation of Christianity was the only reason that went away, especially given that slavery was perpetrated and supported by the Catholic Church, as discussed in the previous video. Go back and take a watch if you haven't had a chance. Let's keep it going.
Drafting people from the Canary Islands and forcing them into slavery, he issued a papal bull called Sicut Dudum, which threatened
Sicko
excommunication
doodum.
upon the perpetrators unless they returned all of those inhabitants back to their land, liberty, and possessions. And his successors, Pius II and Sixtus IV, renewed those moral proclamations with papal bulls of their own. And as we all know, when the Spanish and the Portuguese started to settle the Americas, the importation and abduction of Africans for the purpose of slavery became a part of that equation. And when
Okay, so let's go ahead and notice a few things of what he said. First of all, I think he was saying something about the Canary Islands, right? Now, the Canary Islands are a Spanish autonomous community in Micronesia. As we can probably tell, that really has no bearing on what was going on in the Americas. The Canary Islands are to the west of like Morocco and Mauritania. So, you know, within the sphere of influence of the Moors at this time, I don't believe that those same sort of civilities, and like I referred to before, were extended to people in sub-Saharan Africa after Henry the Navigator made that trek down to Lagos. So I think pointing to the protections of a very singular location might hint more to a political or a economic impetus rather than a moral one for the actions by the Pope in that instance. Of course, we did speak about a few other paper bulls that were written that pretty much endorsed the consignment into perpetual slavery of individuals from Africa. So he might be doing a little bit of cherry picking here, but let's give him a chance and see what else he has to say.
When European natural scientists were still debating whether these people were even human beings or mere beasts of burden, Pope Paul III issued a papal bull called Sublimis Deus that decreed that indigenous people found throughout the world are indeed true human beings who cannot be deprived of their liberty or their land or their property by pain of excommunication. Pope Urban VIII renewed that teaching in his own papal bull Commissum Nobis that condemned anyone who reduces someone else to slavery to excommunication. And it wasn't until the
Now, it seems to me like we got a little bit of wishy-washiness going on in the Catholic Church. I'd love to get those years. I noticed he didn't drop that in the video. Maybe I'll throw them up there. If I figure them out, I'm gonna throw them up over here to get the dates of those particular two papal bulls. Yeah, let's keep going.
The early modern period after the Protestant Reformation, which severely marginalized the teaching authority of the Catholic Church, when slavery starts to get renewed again and starts to appear in Europe and the rest of the world. Now, I'll totally admit that the Church's record on this, the behavior of church members and even clergy and those in authority, it's certainly not spotless.
Okay, thank you. At least he gave us that.
Without the teachings of the Church, without Jesus, without the Bible, the abolition of slavery, which we are now more familiar with, it never would have happened. In historical instances in which we have Catholics violating those teachings, we don't have instances of Catholics being true to their Catholicism. We have
That's true as well.
Failing to uphold the teachings of Catholicism.
Okay, so here we go. I think he might have hit the nail on the head with that. So the instances in which Catholic heads of the church or Catholic leaders employed slavery and did slavery, he equates it to Catholicism. I'm going to take it to Christianity. I would argue that these individuals were not truly being the epitome of Christ followers or Christians. They may have been, subject to the societal pressures or the societal norms or the social norms that they were in, and they buckled what I would consider actual Christianity, actual Christ-like action in favor of whatever meager or intermittent benefit that engaging in that particular activity would provide them. Again, he's to me conflating Christianity with Catholicism, where I don't necessarily have that same faith, but I think that's worth noting. Let's keep it going.
instead preferring to fit in with the contemporary moral fashions of their day.
The
So
zeitgeist.
lessons to be learned from those
The moral
examples
zeitgeist.
blame the church. The church is clear on her condemnation of slavery. The lesson to be learned is to watch out for Catholics who prefer the fashionable moral currents of their day to standing firm in the teachings of the church. And it's a lesson that is relevant for us today because there's no shortage of clergy, bishops, and high-profile Catholics who love to distort Catholic teaching to better fit in with the waning fashionable currents of contemporary society. History will judge them just as harshly. So the reality is,
Big claim
in a
there.
world in which everyone
to unpack.
institutionally practiced slavery, Christendom was the first to take steps towards severely marginalizing it to the point of it virtually being non-existent until they eventually abolished it altogether. And for some reason, internet pop atheists think that they can continue to
Pop
condemn
atheists?
the
I haven't
church
heard that
and
one
she
before.
has some sort of unresolved penance to pay for. Meanwhile, as recently as the 20th century, atheists...
Okay, so here I feel like he's pretty much throwing up a scarecrow to argue against. I consider myself a man of faith, not a pop atheist, but I also believe that having faith does not remove your ability to employ logic. And logically speaking, the church, or as he wants to, I guess, turn into a human she, is not guiltless when it comes to the institution of slavery, particularly the Atlantic slave trade. We talked about the interactions between the Pope and the rulers of Spain and Portugal during their colonization of the Americas, and how that ultimately tied into the establishment of those economic parameters that created the triangle slave trade. Now, there's a bit of cherry picking going on, and he might be able to comfortably make the argument that, hey, eventually we got it right. In which case, I could definitely say that eventually everybody got it right. But to say that she per se, or Christianity per se, not Christianity per se, but the church, the established Catholic Church, is somehow doesn't have any fault in the establishment of that trade, or doesn't have any cross to bear or shame to inherit because of their role in the past. I think that might be venturing out of logic and into just emotion at this point, or fervor.
Atheistic states, officially atheistic states like the USSR, had to erect walls with machine guns to keep people trapped in their slave states. And as we speak, atheist China has people locked in concentration camps simply for believing in God. Hey, thanks for watching that.
Okay,
If you
well,
enjoyed
that
it,
was
be sure to like and
I don't know where he went with that last one, guys. Let's go ahead and switch it back around. Yeah, I'm not really sure what that last little straw man of bringing up atheist China and atheist Russia. The truth of the matter is slavery has always and will probably always exist to a degree. It's a little dark and a little sad to say it that way. I do plan on making a video to talk about neo-slavery. It might get a little hot. I don't want to get demonetized or whatever. We will definitely bring that up and have a conversation about that. But to boil everything down, I do think that he made a few good points, namely in his use of the analogy of Christianity being like a curriculum. That's something I also tend to lean towards in my understanding of Christianity, as far as like some of the things that were written for those people to get them to the level where they could understand something else. What I tend to notice, and particularly around the justification of like racism and the justification of slavery, is a lot of people tend to want to point to the very early parts of the curriculum while ignoring Jesus, who he likened to trigonometry in the actions and teachings that he was actually trying to establish. All in all, I thought it was a pretty poignant breakdown. Great job, Brian. No problem at all with you. You kind of look like the Catholic representation of Jesus. I don't know if that's what you were going for. Notice I say the Catholic representation, not the actual likeness, but we're not going to touch that yet with the 30-foot pole. That being said, I love creating this content for you guys. I do want to continue to do that. So if you want to take a little bit of time for me and hit that notification bell, go ahead and subscribe, like. There were a few moments in the video where you had the opportunity to comment. If you have any thoughts, please drop them in. If you have any topics that you think we should explore in the future, do that as well. But with that, I'm signing off, letting you know to stay stateless and keep an open mind. And I'll see your faces another time. Have a good one, guys.